I'm delighted to be part of this panel discussion on climate change and religion. As we all know, climate change has become a crisis. The planet has already become hotter than any climate we have witnessed in the last 130,000 years. Americans living everywhere in America are feeling this climate change, hotter planet, through extreme weather, heat waves, droughts, fires, floods, and storms. If we keep ignoring this problem and don't take urgent actions, climate change within decades could morph into an existential threat for everyone. So we have to solve the problem now. There are numerous solutions to solve the climate change problem in time. So why are we not taking urgent actions? Simply because the public is not convinced either about the seriousness of the climate change problem or the need to do something about it. And part of the reason is climate change has become politicized. And we know America is divided into two camps, those living on one tent and those living on the second tent. And climate change has got mixed up with all the issues that separate the two camps. And we need urgently to unpack climate change from all the political issues that divide America. I convinced myself an alliance between science and religion can play a major role in bringing both camps to take actions on climate change science. This is based on my experience of last 15 years with the Vatican as a council member of Pope Francis's Pontifical Academy of Science. So let's ask the question, where is the entry point for religion in climate change? You see, because of our inactions to solve the climate change problem, it has morphed into a huge moral ethical issue. Let me just give you one example. More than 50% of the climate pollution is due to the unsustainable consumption by the wealthiest 1 billion people. They're everywhere in the planet. Compare that with the poorest 3 billion, that's 40% of the population, whose role in the climate pollution is very minimal, yet they will suffer the worst consequences of climate change. I took this intragenerational equity issue, the ethical, moral dimensions of this, to Pope Francis, along with 25 other world experts. I briefed Pope Francis in the parking lot just outside his residence. 8 months later, he comes with his climate encyclical, in which he communicated the human dimensions of this problem in just one phrase. He says, the cry of the earth should be heard with cry of the poor. Right? This sort of compassion came through in another exchange I had with Holiness, the Dalai Lama. He said, we need compassion across borders. Later, after that public event, in a private lunch, he asked me, Dr. Ramanathan, tell me, how can you clean the outer environment without cleaning the inner environment? See, all of these interactions persuaded me societal transformation has to be a pillar in our effort to solve the climate change science problem. I'm personally doing this through education at all levels, kindergarten, undergraduate, and the general public. So let me conclude with emphasizing again why I think an alliance with religion can have the transformational impact we need to solve the climate change problem. You see, faith institutions and faith leaders have the moral authority and the tools to communicate the human dimension of this problem and communicate the urgency and thus help us get a transformational support from the public at large. Thank you.
Hey everyone, this is Melody Zhang. I'd love to share a little bit about how I came to care about the climate crisis as an essential part of my Christian witness. My fascination with creation began ever since I started to speak. My first words, which were in Chinese, were 出去, which means go outside. There were seasons of my life devoted to poisonous frogs, another to Michigan birds, and yet another to fish. And when things got overwhelming, I retreated to my neighborhood parks, which served as a sanctuary for me, a place I could communicate with God and be myself. But speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish in the sea inform you. Which of all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind, reads Job 12:7-10. Genesis 2:15 says that the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and take care of it. In the original Hebrew, the two words are avad and shamar, which mean to serve and to protect. They both appear often elsewhere, in reference to God himself watching over and protecting his people. How powerful an image this is. So to me, it is clear that God has entrusted this great gift of creation to us with responsibility to steward it with the utmost intentionality and care. The earth is the very first gift that we are bestowed, and in fact, our first commandment is to tend it and to take care of it. I love people. I can see the Imago Dei, the image of God, uniquely reflected in each person I meet. I believe that Scripture could not be more clear about God's command to love our neighbors as ourselves. When asked what the greatest commandment of all was, Jesus replies, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and your strength." The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. I read on and see that Jesus shows us how much he really means this when he intentionally makes his home on earth among us, and then seeks to draw nearest to the overlooked and the underheard, the outcasts in society. He lovingly lays hands on people who have been shunned. He heals them and spends precious time with them. He tells provocative parables like that of the Good Samaritan, about a traveler who gives selflessly to lift up and nurture a complete stranger back to life. Then Jesus goes so far as to sacrifice himself to the point of death to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross, so that we may have new life. I'm moved and changed by the depth of Jesus' compassion towards me and all of life on earth. So I love because I am deeply compelled by this revolutionary, powerful love which he embodied and modeled for me first. I learned for the first time that our earth was out of balance in my environmental science class at school. As I listened to stories about thousands of species going extinct, entire forests being cleared, and how weather patterns were being hijacked by climate change, I was shaken to my core and enraged that we could allow and even cause these things to happen. The earth is the one home we all have, and it is God's very first and very wonderful gift to us. I can barely begin to imagine how much it must hurt God's heart. I attended university in Michigan, and I decided to continue exploring environmental issues. It was during this time that the Flint water crisis unfolded right next door to us. I listened in utter shock and dismay as my classmates shared about their families having no choice but to drink and bathe in water lined with lead for years until the mainstream media took it up. We organized daily water bottle drives to be sent to the people in Flint, launched campaigns to fundraise for a permanent solution to fixing the corrosive water pipes, and reported on these stories. I learned that 60% of Flint's population was made of people of color, and 40% were under the poverty line. I had heard about environmental issues affecting people negatively, but in this period of my life, I began to understand more fully what environmental injustice and racism looked like played out in real time. It brought urgency to what I was learning in school in a way nothing else did. I was shaken at the reality of suffering I was witnessing, and my heart broke for these people, my neighbors. Didn't Jesus call us to love our neighbors, to look after their well being? Today, I am privileged to serve as a climate justice campaign coordinator at Sojourners, a faith based advocacy organization for social justice, and on the steering committee for Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. As I grow deeper in my journey of loving God and neighbor as self, I continue to witness the upending of livelihoods that my brothers and sisters are already facing here in our very communities and all over the world as a direct result of the climate crisis. After the Flint water crisis, I saw with new eyes that ecological issues are not one-off, siloed problems without consequence to people's lives. California wildfires last year, for instance, were the deadliest, most destructive wildfires ever on record. I encountered these stories, and I cannot help but be changed. If I do nothing, I am complicit. We are seeing unprecedented extreme weather events almost on a weekly basis now, all of which are exacerbated and heightened by climate change. The impacts of the climate crisis are hitting our most vulnerable neighbors first, the very ones Jesus loved to draw close to. People of color, women, people living under the poverty line, and the young generation are already bearing the brunt of the climate crisis while doing the least to contribute to it. No wonder why young people care. We are the first generation who will experience the most intense impacts of this humanitarian crisis, and our livelihoods are in jeopardy. Creation and people, both of which God deeply loves, are in peril. As a Christian, I believe God calls us to a total and radical reimagination and transformation of our relationship with others and the earth. We yearn toward a future vision of complete reconciliation for all of God's created order. I am only one of a swelling movement of young people of faith who are imploring our political leaders to respond faithfully and with full force to love God and neighbor by enacting just, compassionate, and transformative climate policies which rise to the challenge of the climate crisis. And we don't have a lot of time. That is why it takes courage and the creativity, energy, and moral leadership of young people. I want to invite everyone watching and listening to dream beyond a polarized partisanship and into co-creating a world of wholeness together. We can begin to practice the cultivation of wholeness in our communities by addressing the climate crisis faithfully and with the full attention it demands of us. It is a tangible fulfillment of the commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves. That is my prayer for us. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Matt Russell. I'm the Executive Director of Iowa Interfaith Power and Light. And it's absolutely wonderful to be with all of you today here at South by Southwest, talking about how our faith inspires us to climate action. It's great to be here with my colleagues, exploring the idea of how does faith invite us into the kind of climate action that the science says that we need to do. And I want to set the context by first explaining that we're in this great transformation. We're in a transformation unlike any in history, and that is that we are transitioning from the way we've been living for the last 100, 150 years to a new way of living. And we're going to do this all at the same time in a very short time window. That's very different than the Industrial Revolution or the multiple agricultural revolutions. And so as a person of faith, I look at this and I think, this is a really incredible time to be alive. Because in my lifetime, I'm going to be able to be part of this great transformation. And how am I going to shape that? And the science says that we can do it. This isn't it's a technological challenge, but it's not a technological crisis. The crisis is really that of will we do it or not? And so that's a moral question, which is in the wheelhouse of all of our great faith traditions. As an interfaith organization, we do two things. We ask people to go deeper into their own faith tradition. So if you're Muslim or Jewish or Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or one of hundreds and hundreds of indigenous spiritual traditions, we're asking you, go deep into that tradition. And what does that tradition and that spirituality tell you about the moment that we're in terms of environmental justice? And then we ask, as you identify what your faith tradition says, what are those values? And then how do those values connect with similar values from other faith traditions? And so when we think about this, our faith traditions really ask us to care for creation or the environment. They ask us to be loving and to think of others and not just ourselves. They paint pictures and help us understand what home means. And now we collectively live on Earth as our home. And there's no way that I can live on Earth that's not affecting other people on Earth, and vice versa. And so this is a great moment of opportunity to ask the question, what do our faith traditions call us to be doing? And we like to think about the world that the era that we've come from is the fossil fuel era. And that's really about using the carbon stored in those fossils to power our lives. And it's really a vision of scarcity. If you have the fossil fuels, you can build. If you are, in terms of agriculture, which I do a lot in agriculture, we have to use that power to force nature to produce the yields that we need. It's really a vision of scarcity. But if we think about the future in the next 20 years, we have to transition into a world of abundance. We have to think about how we partner with creation, with the environment, in order to get to the solutions that we need. We'll never run out of the sun. We'll never run out of the wind. We'll never run out of the incredible power of the cycles of life, which is managing natural systems in order to get to what we need. So moving from this vision of scarcity to abundance, which really is enough, that our universe provides enough for us, 7 billion, 8 billion, 9 billion, to live together on this planet. And so we have to shift from the fossil fuel era of a vision of scarcity into a future of abundance. And we have to do that in the next really 20 years, 25 years. And it's not a technological problem. It's really a moral problem. And that's where our faith and all those incredible values that we share with each other across the faith traditions, that's inviting us to find the solutions and then implement them. And so really, we're in this moment where faith and science are coming together to both tell us that we have to go through this transformation. And when we do, we're going to live in a better world than we live in today.
Hi, my name is Katharine Hayhoe. I'm a climate scientist because I'm a Christian. Yes, you heard that right. I was studying astrophysics and was planning on continuing to do so when I serendipitously took a class on climate science. And why that changed the rest of my life is not only because I learned that climate science was the exact same physics that I was taking in my astrophysics classes, but it was because I learned that climate change is a threat multiplier. It affects the poorest, most vulnerable, most marginalized and disadvantaged people most, and that just isn't fair. The reason why I switched fields is because I believe, not in spite of it. Now, I know that too often today people think of science and faith as conflicting. And if we think of scientists and we think of people who identify with a specific faith, we usually picture it something like this. Two circles that only overlap perhaps a tiny little bit, and in the middle you have a unicorn, and if you know me, you might think the unicorn looks like this. Here's the interesting thing though. Elaine Eklund is a sociologist from Rice University who studies scientists. In a survey she did of over 1,700 natural and social scientists at top research universities across the United States, she found that 50% of us identify with a specific religious label. 50%. 70% of us consider ourselves to be spiritual people. In other words, we think there's more to life than what we scientists can see and observe and document and quantify. And perhaps most interestingly, of the 30% who identify as atheist, 20% of those consider themselves to be spiritual atheists. The idea that science and faith are not in conflict is not new. The National Academy of Sciences published this report in 1999. Which states that scientists, like many others, are touched with awe at the order and complexity of nature. Indeed, many scientists are deeply religious. But they went on with what's called the non-overlapping magisteria approach to say that they occupy two separate realms. And indeed they do. But at the same time, that does not mean that they are in competition or that they are two alternate and mutually exclusive systems of belief. When it comes to complex, thorny, difficult issues, and there's no issue more thorny, complex, and difficult than climate change in our world today, I would argue that we need them both. Why do we need the science? Well, first of all, science tells us how we are affecting our world. Science tells us that climate is changing, humans are responsible, and we really have checked. Science also tells us why it matters. Climate change matters because it is affecting us here and now. It isn't just an environmental issue or a future issue. Climate change affects the air that we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the safety of our homes, national security, the economy, and our health. That's what science can tell us. And science can tell us one more thing. It can tell us what the impact of our choices will be. If we continue to burn coal and gas and oil, if we transition quickly to clean sources of energy, if we're more efficient and less wasteful with our resources, science can tell us what the outcome of different choices will be. But here's where our values come in. And for most, not all of us, but for most of us, our values come from our faith. We need our values to tell us what to do about it. Because you could give the same facts to 10 different people and you could come up with 10 different potential solutions, many of which might be accurate or right. Why do those differ? They differ because of our values. And so on climate change, that's why I'm so heartened to hear religious leaders like Pope Francis, the U.S. National Association of Evangelicals, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Dalai Lama, speaking out about the need to act on climate. There's 80 Muslim leaders who signed the Islamic Declaration on Climate Change. There's over 20,000 young evangelicals for climate action right here in the United States. When it comes to climate action and science, we need everybody and everyone if we're going to have a chance of fixing this thing. In the United States, white evangelicals and white Catholics are right at the bottom of the pile in terms of who cares least about climate change and is least accepting of the evidence. So because of that, we often think that it's something that people believe or where they go to church on Sunday or don't that affects their opinion on climate change. But research has shown that it isn't what we believe or where we go to church. It is one thing: politics. That's right. Where someone falls on the political spectrum in the United States is the number one predictor of whether they agree with the simple facts that climate is changing, humans are responsible, and the impacts are serious. The reason why this shows up as a signal in different religious groups is because of the connection between religion and politics that has grown in the US over the last, not just years, but decades. So where do we go now after this election? This election was incredibly politically polarized. In fact, the United States is now more politically polarized than it's been in decades. And that's why it's so important to connect with people over shared values other than politics. There's a lot of those shared values that we can connect over, faith being one of them, and that's what we're here to discuss.
We've done a lot of work in Iowa with farmers, and farmers are there's this kind of conversation about permission structures in politics. Mm-hmm. So farmers are really considered expert voices, right? And so they also have been pretty skeptical about climate change, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But the fact that farmers have been pretty vocal about being skeptical of climate change has driven the politics. And a lot of people, when we started doing this work with farmers in Iowa, they said, you don't even bother talking to farmers about climate change because they're all, they're conservative, they're Republican, and we can talk about other things. And I'm a farmer, right? I mean, I farm as well as lead this organization. And I knew that it wasn't the case. But what I knew was that people were not inviting farmers to have this conversation. And once we reached out and started inviting farmers into church basements in a safe space where we said, look, we're going to talk about it directly. And we start with prayer or reflection. We're interfaith, so we center people spiritually. We have a conversation. We ask them, how is God? How's the Spirit calling you in your vocation as a farmer? How does that connect to, how's your call as a farmer connect to being part of the solution to the climate crisis? We just reframe the conversation around their faith and their values and their identity as farmers, rather than their identity as part of a political tribe, right? Or even their identity as a particular type of farmer, right? We go deeper into a deep sense of identity as you are a person of faith and you're a farmer. And then you get conversations with organic farmers and big conventional farmers and smaller farmers. And they have the conversation about their care for the environment, stewardship, their identity as a farmer, and their shared concern about wanting to be part of a solution. So there's an example of how we do that in kind of a concrete way.
Katharine, I want to pick up the issue you brought up. I agree with you. Climate change has become politicized. And with America divided into two Americas, Democrats and Republicans, climate change got put into the Democrat camp. And it became part of all the issues that divide us. I think the biggest challenge for climate scientists like you and me is to unpack climate change from all the issues that divide America. People can stay in their separate tents, but we have to persuade them that climate change is not a Democrat issue. Climate change is not a Republican issue. It's an issue of human tragedy, and we have to solve it independent of whether we are a Democrat or Republican.
I think when I think of religion and climate change are in conflict as the question, I feel as if I don't hear that very much amongst the young generation. I just want to kind of add that generational aspect to it. I think that young people that I know accept and believe the science. We have environmental science class, and I think we don't see science and faith as diametrically opposed. And so my question is this: perhaps we can believe that young people maybe live and embody an integrated theology about what's going on right now. What I see right now is that, young people grow up thinking and hearing about climate change in the news, and it's really normalized, and our lives are at stake. And so I think seeing the effects of what's happening today and how the world is increasingly complex and interconnected, we recognize that interconnectedness in each other and of the earth. And I think I don't see it as climate justice as a movement as very divisive of an issue for the young generation, even for young people of faith. So just want to add that to the dialogue. I have been able to not only be able to engage with churches around me on climate change and ecological issues, but also had the privilege to be able to train and equip other young leaders on how to communicate faith and climate change together in their communities. So I think some really helpful things that I've learned with talking about climate change with friends and family and churches is that it's really important to use depoliticizing language during this time. I like to talk about what's possible together and what's possible to build together in our communities and to co-conspire together to build something new. I like to talk about what we're able to do when we are focusing on something as the end goal and in the process to create beloved community in that space. And I think that's kind of the starting point where I'm telling stories and
I'm sharing about what is possible when we act on climate together, whether it be in places of worship or just in my friend community, etc. And it's really important, I think, and helpful to talk about common values, right? And in the faith community, it's really I like to talk about the moral responsibility to care for God's earth, and not just to think of it as a very abstract and obscure way, but really to start small on a community level. What can we do together as a church or as a small community to act on climate today? And that could be, praying and petitioning for our members of Congress to act compassionately on climate change. Or it can be praying with our feet by going out on the streets and marching together. And often that ends up in a lot of fun and community building and getting to know one another in the process. And I think also using the framework of health, that climate change and climate disasters are affecting people's lives. I want to also touch on how health and framing it in the framework of health is really key. I think about the ways that Jesus was here on earth and was intentionally reaching out to people who were marginalized. And I think about how people who are most affected today are marginalized communities, often people of color and people living under the poverty line, and how lives and bodies are at stake. And so I think about the ways that we are called as a community to care for other people's health, for each other's health, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. So those are some things that I think about when I talk about climate change with my friends and communities and churches.
I want to pick up on that issue of health. I think it's one of the most critical message we need to convey. Let me just give you two examples of health effects. The fossil fuels, which is the main culprit for climate change, global warming, also puts out pollution, air pollution, which kills 5.5 million people every year. Okay? And if you just factor in the cost of that alone, it's more than $5 trillion every year is lost. First. Second, there was a major scientific breakthrough 4 years ago when meteorologists, who are normally on the conservative side of as far as linking climate change with weather is concerned, came to the unanimous conclusion that we are witnessing new weather extremes because we have created a new climate. And weather extremes cause tremendous amount of health effects. Over 600,000 died just from fires, floods, droughts, and others in the last 15 years. So now we have sound scientific basis to support what Melody is saying, that we need to talk about the health effects. And the other example I want to give there is if you look at the major environmental laws American government has passed since the 1960s, it's always on health. Air pollution is because of cancer and other health effects. We decided to get rid of the ozone damaging pollutants because it was causing skin cancer. So health is an important topic for the climate scientists like Katharine and myself to pivot to when we talk about this.
Several years ago, I was invited to speak at a very conservative Christian college. And the week before I was due to arrive, I got an email that stated that the only solutions that I could possibly talk about to climate change were abortion. And since the college was very pro-life, what was the point of even having me come to talk? So what I decided to do was I threw what I was planning to say in the garbage, and I said, I'm going to give a whole talk on how climate change is a pro-life issue. And if you believe in life, not just from conception to birth, as so many people seem to, but from conception to death, then you should be out at the front of the lines praying with your feet, as Melody said, and demanding climate action, because fossil fuel use, air pollution, and climate change are global health issues. So anyone who cares about the lives of anyone else on this planet, including themselves, their children, their families, their communities, the poor and the vulnerable and the marginalized right here at home, as well as on the other side of the world, we already care about climate change, even if we don't realize it.
It's about 3 years ago to just right now that I interviewed with the board to become the director of Iowa Interfaith Power and Light. And I remember very distinctly, because I prepared for the interview, that I was very adamant to the board. And I said, if you hire me, we are not going to spend one penny. I'm not going to spend 1 minute of my time debating climate change or trying to change anybody's mind, because we're gonna work with those people who are ready to start engaging. And anybody who says, you're just preaching to the choir, I'm like, yeah, that's what choirs do. They sing, and we're gonna sing, right? But so that's kind of like my intuitive. But now that I've been doing this for almost 3 years, I come to understand that a little bit better, a little deeper. And Katharine, I've heard you many times, and you've been really helpful in this as well. And part of it is understanding the dynamic of the whole climate skepticism movement. And when we debate, we're actually responding to what those investments want us to do, right? Because when we start to debate, what we're doing is we're getting into an identity issue, right? So we're debating identity. We're not really talking about the issue. We're debating identity. So identity is really important, right? And so what I've come to understand is that how do I talk to friends? How do I talk to family? How do I encourage faith leaders to talk to their faith community? And that is, and from kind of a monotheistic perspective, but I think it works for broader religions as well. Substitute God for the universe or whatever the spirit. So what I like to say is, who you are is who God needs. So that's the starting point. Not, do you believe what I believe, or can you believe that, or to not get into that identity issue of it's my identity against your identity. It's who am I as created by God as part of this universe? And what if who I am is who's really needed? And so it changes the dynamic of the conversation. And it becomes then, how am I as who I am part of the solution? Versus how do I join the right team, right? And so we do spend a lot of time talking to people who are ready to act or are on the verge of acting. But what happens when we do that is that we end up inviting more people into the discussion by our example than by winning the debate. I get that quite a bit because we're an interfaith organization. We work statewide in Iowa. And I'm part of the national network of Interfaith Power and Light. So we're the state affiliate in Iowa. And what we say is people of faith and conscience. And so, there are a lot of people who care deeply about the climate crisis. One of our most, adamant major donors, and he's a major donor because he's like completely dedicating his life in the legal profession to advocating for, climate solutions, but adamantly atheist. But the values that motivate him are very similar to the values that motivate me as a Christian, right? His conscience, his sense of values. He doesn't have to belong to a specific faith tradition or even identify himself as a faithful person. But if we share the same values, then we need to figure out how to partner together. We need to create that space so that people can feel part of, who you are is who the world needs, who the universe needs. I may call that God, you may call it something else, but we have now a commonality that we can work together on this.
A few years ago, I was heading to one of our big scientific conferences where we all present the results of our research. And that's often where a lot of scientists meet up to talk about things. And so I got an email from a colleague asking if we could meet for lunch, but he didn't specify any particular project he wanted to talk about. So I wasn't quite sure why we were meeting. And so I walked in, and before I had even barely sat down, he leaned across the table to me. He said, "I'm not a Christian, but I care about climate change too." And I was very surprised. I said, "Well, of course, because I assume somebody who has dedicated their life to studying this would care about it." And he went on to say, "I care about it because it disproportionately affects the poorest, most marginalized, most vulnerable people in the world, and it is not fair." He said, "I'm a humanist, and that's why I care about climate change." And so to me, that was not anything that I had ever thought that people didn't care about, but it was a lesson to show that really we only have to be one thing to care about climate change. And that one thing is a human living on planet Earth, and we are all humans living on planet Earth. And so that's why this really is an all-encompassing human issue.
I'm asked at the end of all my talks to the public, what can I do? And I ask them, it depends on whether you can do just one thing or more than one. Mm-hmm. If you can do more than one, of course, change light bulbs, change your behavior, etc. But honestly, it's too late for individual actions to stop the crises, which is going to evolve into a catastrophe just 10 years from now. I've already gone on record predicting that we will pass a major threshold we call threshold for dangerous climate change in just 10 years from now. So what is it all of us can do? Basically communicate the urgency of the problem and the real dangers of not doing anything about it, particularly to the poor, which was brought up in the earlier discussion. And there are about 3 billion people who have either not discovered fossil fuels or can't afford it. They are still relying on 18th century technologies, 3 billion. And they will be first to go down that cliff when we approach that cliff, whether it's 10 years or 30 years has to be seen. So we need to get action. That action has to come from the wealthiest 1 billion who contribute at least 60% to the climate pollution. So I see communication using social media, particularly to those who are just sitting on the right side of the middle, persuade about the urgency and the need to take action. So that would be my the most critical thing we can do, get that bottom-up support. And the main hopeful sign I see there is the youth movement. And we just, adults have to follow them.
I like to talk about light bulbs. Right? Do you remember about 10 years ago when we had these like, I mean, they were tribal kind of identity politics around light bulbs, and we were going to ruin the world because we didn't have incandescent light bulbs and people were hoarding them, and it became like this flashpoint, right? And if you think about it now, we have LEDs that are less expensive than incandescent light bulbs. They do 10 times as many things. They last 10 times as long. Like the incandescent light bulb compared to the LED is just worlds apart. The LED is such a better light bulb. And if we had just depended on individuals to be loud, we wouldn't have gotten the LED. We got the LED because we made a systems investment, right? It was not just a bunch of individuals, entrepreneurs and others, but it was government, it was policy, it was incentives. And so we can't we're not going to get there by changing light bulbs, one light bulb at a time. It is a systems approach. Like, we have got to put our shoulders to the wheel, work together, lean into the values, and figure out how we incentivize the kinds of solutions that we know we need, and we get serious about doing that. And we're going to do that at the government level. And that's what the Paris Accord was so great, is because people showed up to Paris and the business community said, hey, we need a public policy platform to deal with this. And public leaders came and said, we need a public policy platform to deal with this. So even though it's not perfect, we at least got over a tipping point of where the majority of the world, whether it's business or individuals or politicians, saying it's going to take a public policy framework. So that's important, systems change. But going back to what can I do when I change that light bulb, when I do my recycling, when I decide not to buy a gas-powered mower, but I'm going to mow with my own legs and arms in an old-fashioned, right? Those are very important if we think about them in terms of a spiritual exercise.
Yeah.
Right? Because when I'm intentional about that, it's not that my carbon footprint gets smaller, even though it does. The real miracle, the real thing that happens is that I'm now intentional and I'm paying attention and I'm prayerfully asking myself, what more can I do? And I'm serving as an example to others. And so we're not going to get there by individual actions alone, but those individual actions are still very important to building the momentum so that we can collectively do the system change that is needed.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, Matt. I think of it in terms of sort of embodying climate justice, embodying what we want to see in the world first, and really practicing that for ourselves, so that what we want to bring into the world, the joy and the liberation and the justice we want to see in the world, is really coming from an authentic, grounded place in our own lives. And so in some ways, I think we can consider it discipleship if you're of the Christian faith, and that's kind of like personal discipleship almost. And then we can go deeper in our journey of climate action, for taking action for the well-being of our climate-affected neighbors by petitioning members of Congress to prioritize climate, advocating for these policies that address the climate crisis, and supporting and voting for local legislators who share this concern. And like I said, voting and praying with our feet through direct action. So those are all kind of a plethora of options of things that we could do together in community. And I like to call that public discipleship. So that's kind of, going deeper in the journey of climate discipleship. And then I also wanted to add another thing that churches can do is to find people who are affected by climate change, in their communities, or affected by environmental racism or injustice in your own city or community, who are already building solutions on the ground, and to follow their leadership, follow their models of resilience that they're already showing. And so, if churches can be able to build strong partnerships where we're learning and listening and following the leadership of the people who are most affected and most effective, I think that that's a really powerful place to start as churches, because I think change starts from the ground up. And I think it'd be awesome if we were able to be held accountable to folks who are leading on the front lines of climate justice today. So yeah, that's another thing that I'd like to share.
To fix this thing, we have to change the world. As Ron said, individual actions at this point aren't enough. But the good news is the world has changed before. Think of 200 years ago, slavery. 100 years ago, or a little bit more, women not being able to vote. 30 years ago, everybody smoking like there was no tomorrow. The world has changed, and how it's changed is not a mystery. It's changed through social contagion, through people, individuals deciding this is not the way things should be. There's a better way to be. And living that out in their own lives, but most of all, sharing that with other people. We all know what contagion looks like these days with coronavirus. We need the good kind of contagion where we share and spread this through the visual example of how we live, through talking about it, talking about why it matters and what we can do to fix it, through sharing what we've learned with everyone who we know. That is the most important way that each of us as individuals can make a difference. And we know in the past that that is the way that individuals have changed the world.
I just had the privilege of working with a really awesome artist on this zine project that's called the Creation and Climate Care Zine. That is this doodle-filled and accessible and fun way to learn about what's happening and how we can take action together on climate change. That's really directed towards the younger generation and for people, whether you're 13 or 83, it's accessible to you, and it's a visual resource that I hope that is really helpful. It covers climate justice and the ways that women and climate change intersect, and racial justice and climate change. It covers communicating on climate change with people in your church community, and it covers climate science as well. And so my hope really was that to address the fact that I think for many of us, we don't necessarily have a lot of time to research and do a lot of digging and news search on what's going on and to keep up with that. And it also is very overwhelming to do that. And so we wanted to create this resource that was just really easy to dive into and digest. And learn about what we can do together, and all of the spectrum of actions that we can take in our church communities and personally as well. So I love to lift that up and share that with everyone. And you can download that at the link that we can provide.
I'd like to bring another resource. This was created by all 10 campuses of the University of California system. We have created this course called Bending the Curve, Climate Change Solutions. It's one of the very few such climate literacy program which dives into the multidimensional aspects of it, not only the science, but also the human dimensions, things like environmental justice, role of religion, and then also technology and others. So it's taught to all the students in UC campus, and we have created a online version of it. Any public person can enroll.
So I'm part of Interfaith Power and Light. We're the Iowa affiliate. I think there's 40 affiliates or about that. So not quite every state has an affiliate, but most states, almost all the states do. So the national network, Interfaith Power and Light, and then your state affiliate is a great resource. I want to lift up Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. Again, a wonderful network. And then Ram, I know you did some work with the Vatican. The Laudato Si is an amazing document.
Yes.
And so not just for Catholics, but Pope Francis has really written that as a document for the world, our common home. And then lastly, just Google Katharine Hayhoe. I'm probably getting it wrong. It's like Weirding Science and some wonderful videos out there. But you have a new thing too called Women in Science or Mothers in Science?
Yes.
Or Science Moms.
Science Moms.
Yeah. So just there's some really wonderful resources out there that are really a part of our work, but other things as well.
Thank you, Matt. In terms of resources, I would say, first of all, seek out and follow one or more organizations who share your values or your faith and who are concerned about climate change on social media. There are so many organizations that do a fantastic job. They might be on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, and I'll just name a couple of them. There's Climate Caretakers, there's Tear Fund, there's Arasha, there's the Evangelical Environmental Network, the Catholic Climate Covenant, there's Green Muslims, there's Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. There's almost any group in any range you could possibly imagine. Find them and follow them so you're getting that input. And then if you want more information, if you want a little bit more information, our YouTube series, Global Weirding, gives you that, over 35 short episodes. If you want more information, the Bending the Curve course that Ram talked about is fantastic. You can register for free. You don't have to pay. If you want a class credit, then you can pay. There's so much there at every level. But often we feel overwhelmed, like we don't know where to start. So that's why we started Science Moms, because if anybody's overwhelmed, it's moms. We know that moms do not have time to dig into all the details. And so with that organization, we just aim to curate resources in an easy, accessible way for people who don't have a lot of time. And I'm going to be totally honest with you, we've had quite a few people sign up who are not moms. So there's no proof of children required to sign up for this if you want someone to curate those resources. All of this is out there and available. There's no reason not to. Thank you so much for listening to our panel. I hope that you've had some new ideas and had some new thoughts on how everybody has shared that climate change isn't a niche issue. It's not just an environmentalist issue. It's not just a Democrat or a liberal issue. Climate change is an everyone and an everything issue. And what that means is that you are the perfect person to care. And the most important thing that you can do is share why it matters and what we can all do to fix it with everyone you know.